So let's hear it for the first and arguably most successful Magnum round ever made, 357 Magnum. Welcome back to Bullets and Brass, folks. We are doing another caliber video. And honestly, I can't believe it's taken me this long to do 357. I talked about it in the past. It's gotten touched on in various videos, but never did a video on 357 Magnum. And it is overdue. It is a staple in the handgun industry. It is one of the most popular calibers out there overall. Not in terms of volume of shot. It's not as commonly purchased at this point, but it's still extremely popular. Now, we are not going to get into mostly the ballistics and things like that. We're going to talk about the history, because the development of 357 Magnum was the start of an era. Let's talk about where it came from, who was involved, and why. Now, we've got three names. The names involved in creating this caliber, interesting. You're going to know two of them, and one of them is probably going to be new to you. The first one, everybody should recognize. If you don't know who Elmer Keith is, either you're new to firearms or you just never really looked into the history and the writers and anything. You're just you go to the range and shoot. Elmer Keith is the guy who basically put big bore handguns back on the radar for the public. He was a writer, he was a developer for hot loads for various calibers, and his professional career in firearms started as a rancher and a guide in the 20s and 30s. And 1920s and 30s, not 18, guys. But he also did some writing, and he was pretty influential. He was pivotal in the creation of 357 Magnum. He was taking 38 Special and heavy-duty revolvers, target revolvers of the era, and loading them up to what is now almost 357 Magnum pressure. And he was doing this and talking about it, writing about it. You know, it was a thing. He was the kind of guy who knew firearms both from a theoretical and a real-world perspective. He understood what it took to get the job done, what really worked, and what was just cute on paper. Then you've got Douglas Wesson, I believe, grandson or son of Dan Wesson, who started Smith & Wesson Firearms, along with the Smith side. Now, most of you have probably never heard of Douglas Wesson. You know his last name, and you can make the connection to Wesson Firearms. But he was the industry insider. He was the guy with the resources, the connections, and the direct outlet, because he owns a firearms company, right, to make the caliber commercially available as opposed to being a wildcat. He was also the guy who said, hey, there's more of a need for this than just people who want a wildcat. The market needs this round. We need a round that is superior to 38. More power. But 38 Super, which is what Colt was putting out, is not what the police want. And the police are the primary market, right? In that era, the police were the biggest market. And like today, they drove the civilian market. So even though he's probably the one most responsible for the commercial success of the round, he doesn't get a whole lot of credit. We usually credit it to Elmer Keith. But I think that in terms of making the round a commercial success, Douglas Wesson is probably the key name in this whole thing. Without his support, without his drive, without his resources, we might have just been stuck with Elmer Keith's 38 plus P. Maybe it's a 38 Keith, and it's a hot load 38 that only, target frame and heavier revolvers can use. And it's worth noting that Elmer Keith, other than his 38 hot loads for himself, was really focused on larger calibers. The 38 was kind of 357 Magnum, was kind of a small one for him. He was much more in the 40s, 44s, things like that, which came later. He was the guy influencing 41 and 44 Magnum. So the last name on the list is Phillip B Sharpe. Now, most of you have never heard of him. If you're into gun writers and ballisticians from the 30s and 50s, he's relatively well known, but I mean, you're talking way back, right? Outside of that, nobody knows him. It doesn't help that he died relatively young. So Mr. Sharpe wrote about ballistics and the technical side of shooting, energy levels, things like that. He wasn't so much talking about the guns as the performance. He was also a bit of a businessman beyond his writing skills. He was mostly a writer, but he also had an import business for firearms and a few other things, and he had some connections. But he understood the firearms business. So like Wesson, he really probably helped on the commercial side of this as opposed to just the developmental side. But I would not understate his participation in developing the ballistics of that round. Like Mr. Keith, Phillip served during World War II on the production side rather than overseas. He was a captain in the Ordnance Department of the U.S. Army. Obviously, that came after 357 Magnum because that was in 1935, and he was not serving with the U.S. military at the time. So why the history lesson? Why, we're talking about the people instead of the cartridge? Because the round wouldn't exist without those specific people. It wasn't a round where a company wanted it and they hired some developers or they had their staff to come up with it. That round was really developed by those three people. They were what made it happen. Without them, nothing. And you've got Keith hot loading 38 Special. Heavy frame revolvers, talking about it, writing about it, but no real drive to turn this into a commercial thing. Smith & Wesson was trying to reassert their dominance over Colt and focus on the police market and saw an advantage in keeping with the revolver theme because the police were used to them. They had them. They were comfortable with them. Training doctrine is already there. And the police are dealing with bootleggers and gangsters who are using cars as cover. They're using early bulletproof equipment, whether it's panels in the cars, early bulletproof vests. Those things could stop 38 Special. They could stop a lot of the pistol rounds at the time, but 38 Super and then 357 Magnum could punch through. You needed a hotter round than 38 Special, but the police don't want to retrain on autos, and autos at the time were considered less than 100% reliable. That really didn't come about until the 80s and 90s, right? Police switched over en masse. They actually ended up toning it down. The original official 357 Magnum load would probably be considered a plus P load these days. It was hot. And they got it down to something the average policeman could use. Even then, as we know, a lot of police stuck with 38 Special for a very long time. But very often their revolvers were 357 capable. So if you were comfortable with it, you could use it. And then obviously there was a lot of marketing, a lot of advertising and getting guns produced in the right caliber, getting them out there, marketing it to the police departments. So in an era where semi-autos are less than 100% reliable, or at least considered that way, the police are already strongly oriented toward revolvers and trained in them, 357 Magnum versus 38 Super became an easy decision for the police. Why not? You can keep using your 38 Special ammo, too. You've already got a bunch of ammo in the arsenal. Keep shooting it. Training doesn't have to change. You don't have to come up with new doctrine. You don't have to completely retrain people. This counts. We're in the Depression, right? This is still Depression era. We're just coming out of it. But, the economy is not great. The economy didn't really recover until World War II was well underway. So a police department going, well, we don't have to replace holsters maybe. We don't have to replace all of our revolvers. We can roll this in. Hey, as new people come on the force, they get a 357 instead of a 38 as we replace revolvers because we don't have to change the training. What do you get from 357 and how does it compare today? So the short answer, you get one of the finest general purpose revolver rounds, handgun rounds ever made. A light load, fun, recreational shooting, easy to train on. Heavier loads all the way up through hunting almost anything on this continent. Defensively, excellent round, right? Everybody considers it, almost the pinnacle. You can use it in a lever action rifle. You can use it in a Derringer. It's a very good round for many, many things. Performance, like I said, is still, we look at 357 Magnum as this is the round. This is what we compare everything else to, and usually to the other round's detriment. Now, the long answer is that the 125 grain JHP standard load is about 580 foot-pounds of energy, compared to barely 500 for some really hot plus P plus 9mm stuff. So Half a century later, the police have effectively downgraded their firepower per round in order to get more capacity. If they could hit their target, 357 Magnum would probably be better. And I'm being sarcastic. There's more on that issue. But just saying, if you hit the target with the first round, 357 Magnum is more effective than even really hot 9mm. Just for some perspective on that, the muzzle energy of that 357 Magnum is higher than the energy of a 55 grain 223 Remington load at 300 yards. So, yeah. Now, penetration with the proper bullet can be excellent for hogs and deer. You do have to put it in the right place. You don't get that kind of hydrostatic energy shock that you do with a rifle round at higher velocity. But as long as you hit the right spot, absolutely works great. 357 Magnum succeeded because it has the holy grail of ammo development: a clear role with significant demand, major industry support, and good marketing. This hasn't changed since. We see this today in all the new ammo releases. If you have those three things, something has to go horribly wrong to not be successful. 357 Magnum came out at the right time, with the right marketing, the right demand, and good industry support. Success.